An overabundance of nutrients from agricultural runoff can lead to excessive algal growth and deteriorating water quality. However, this type of pollution is difficult to regulate because its source is not directly measurable. This topic area explores state-of-the-art methods for detecting algal blooms, tools for modeling the origins of non-point source pollution, and regulatory options for addressing the challenge. Our panel is comprised of 4 esteemed scientists and scholars. Dr. Jana Compton is a senior research ecologist with the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development. She focuses on identifying the sources and effects of nutrient pollution at local to national scales. Dr. Zachary Easton is the Alphen Professor of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Virginia Tech, where he focuses on water quality in the context of both native and managed systems. The Easton Lab's core research, teaching, and extension programs focus on synergies between soil and water resources, environmental change, biophysics, and sustainable land use in agricultural ecosystems using an interdisciplinary approach. Dr. Kelly Luis is a scientist in the Water and Ecosystems Group at the Jet Propulsion Lab. Her research focuses on the development of aquatic remote sensing algorithms for environmental monitoring, forecasting, and decision-making. And Dr. Bryn Stewart is a postdoctoral scholar in environmental science and engineering at Caltech. She studies the relationship between hydrological and biogeochemical processes in the critical zone and how they influence stream and water chemistry. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jana Compton. Thank you for coming, or thank you for inviting me, is really what I mean to say. So my father was a physicist, and he got invited to give a talk here in the late 60s, we think. And so this morning I spent my time walking around and finding the statues or the busts of Feynman and Einstein to take pictures and share with my mom. So it's kind of cool to be here on campus, beautiful campus. So I'm going to be speaking about non-point source pollution and the science needs for water quality monitoring. I'm part of the Office of Research and Development with EPA, which is EPA's research arm. So we're more like academics and USGS than we are like the regulatory side of EPA. I always like to say that at the beginning of a talk, especially when I've heard EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, come up many, many times today. But there were many things that the previous speakers said that resonated with me. I'm going to try to touch on some of those ideas as I go through. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Robert Sabo, who is in DC with EPA, with the same group at EPA, and he actually was invited to give the talk, and I'm sort of filling in for him because he's got some things going on at home with new babies. And then Amalia Handler, who works on cyanohabs, and then Ann Ray, who leads our nutrient research within the Office of Research and Development. So I'm going to talk about some key research needs. Many of Laura mentioned many of these being issues and concerns. Quantifying non-point source pollution is challenging, but it's really important, and we need to try. We need to do our best. We need to find ways to connect the inputs to water quality impacts. I heard several of the speakers earlier talking about the sources and the endpoints. And then also kind of asking the question of connecting conservation practices, management practices to nutrient loads and water quality information. And so I'm going to go through a couple of things that we work on at EPA, the EPA's National Nutrient Inventory to get at the sources, EPA's National Aquatic Resources Survey to get at the water quality responses, and then talk about some challenges to understand basically the question that a lot of my research is moving toward. I've been with EPA for 25 years, I meant to mention that. Moving from quantifying the sources and the impacts to asking questions about, is it working? Are the billions of dollars that we're spending every year on conservation, on management, on restoring water quality, is it having an impact? Is it doing the things that we want it to do? I think that's for a really important question. So is it working? That's the simple way when we talk to farmers in the Willamette Valley. Is it working? So I'm going to start with the systems diagram. I'm a biogeochemist. We like these box and arrow diagrams more than anything. So we've got the demands, the human demand for nitrogen, just as an example. I have a phosphorus cascade, but I don't have time to go through all this. But the nitrogen cascade developed by Jim Galloway at University of Virginia. We have human needs for energy and food that really drive the movement of nitrogen into the environment. We have a lot of cycling. I guess, I don't know if this pointer works. Oh, there we go. Can you guys see that? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. The cycling on the land, the movement into the atmosphere, and so we have ozone, which is human health and crop health concern, particulate matter, same for human health, and lots of other impacts, greenhouse gas effects, stratospheric ozone depletion. Actually, N2O is the largest stratospheric ozone depleting chemical that there is right now. We also have movement of that nitrogen into water. And the concept of the cascade is really that one molecule can move around and have multiple impacts, and that's why we have the cascade. And then we have the endpoint. So we have these externalities. Nitrogen moves beyond its intended use and moves into other places where it can cause drinking water contamination. We've done a lot of work with nitrate in drinking water across the country and also locally. I didn't put any slides, but I'd be happy to talk about that at some point. The health effects of smog, coastal hypoxia, and also cyano-harmful algal blooms, and so cyanoHABs. And so all of these endpoints, very important, and kind of making these connections is very important for the scientists. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the EPA's National Nutrient Inventory, which is how we determine where nitrogen is coming from and where phosphorus is coming from in the environment. So I made I like these Sankey diagrams. I had an engineering student work with me, and so I'm getting some head nods. These are engineers, a lot of engineers in the room, and the Sankey diagram has been really helpful for looking at the fate of nitrogen and phosphorus. You can see ag fertilizer, farm fertilizer is the largest source of nitrogen if you just look at the conterminous US, largest anthropogenic source of nitrogen to the landscape. The second largest source, because we have the Clean Air Act and we cleaned up a lot of our nitrogen deposition, the second largest source is now crop biological infixation, things like soybeans and alfalfa. And then total deposition is the next largest source, and then we have things like livestock waste, natural biological infixation, which is not necessarily anthropogenic, and then other smaller sources. All of these sources can be important depending on where you are in space and across the landscape. You can see some of that nitrogen goes into crops and some of it stays in the environment as what we call surplus, goes into soils, may go back up into the atmosphere, it may leach into groundwater or run off into surface waters. So in the inventory, I just put a little QR code if anybody wants to learn more about it and see some of the papers. What's in the inventory, we can track anthropogenic inputs and outputs. We can track pollution through time. We can identify the largest or dominant source. We can communicate with people. And we can explain patterns in water quality over time and space. We also put together a phosphorus budget. Phosphorus looks really different. It's not as complex as nitrogen. There's not as many atmospheric forms that move around and do things. But so you can see here, actually, the largest source is livestock waste. The largest source of inputs to anthropogenic inputs to watersheds across the US is livestock waste. I just put these figures together a little while ago, and it was kind of surprising to me within the last year that that's the largest source for phosphorus. It's kind of different. It's different than the nitrogen inputs. Then we have farm fertilizer, obviously, is a very large source and nearly as large as the livestock waste. And then we have another host of inputs, including human waste, which is important depending on where you are. So I'll talk about the spatial patterns. I have a lot of maps of the US in this talk. So in the center of the US, we have fertilizer in yellow in farmland. And other parts of the country, I'm from Oregon, so I kind of go to the northwest, but we have many parts of the country where fertilizer is the largest source. This is a HUC 8, Hydrologic Unit Code 8, which is kind of a nice scale to look at the US watershed landscape. So this is also livestock waste. You can see kind of on the edges of farmland, and especially in the southeast, livestock waste is the largest source of nitrogen. In red is human waste. That's near cities. For example, Puget Sound. In Seattle, there's about 65% of the nitrogen going into Puget Sound is from human waste. And then the blue is deposition. So that's where atmospheric deposition, that's the largest source in both the east and the west. And so you can kind of see these different spots on the landscape. Phosphorus, there's a lot of similarities. You can see where farm fertilizer in the center of the country is the largest source. But you can also see this importance of livestock waste, particularly in rangeland in the west, and just other areas all throughout the southeast, very important. And so we have some areas where deposition's important. We have a few areas where human waste is important, especially along the East Coast. So in terms of connecting the inputs to the water quality endpoints, we have the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and there's a number of things that, there's scientific requirements and scientific questions that are associated with these mandates from Congress that are associated with these acts. But the administrators of EPA, for example, the first administrator, and I think maybe the fourth or fifth, William Ruckelshaus, he said, "What do you mean you don't know how many acid lakes there are?" So that was a question to the science community within, the broader science community, but particularly within EPA. A congressman from Illinois, are our waters getting better or worse? William Riley, who was the administrator under Reagan, said, "Good news, based on my years in the environmental movement, I think the agency does an exemplary job of protecting the nation's public health and quality of the environment." I think a lot of what was said about the drinking water systems, and I think that is true for many, many chemicals. Bad news, I can't prove it. So they didn't have the data to really address these questions. And so in response to that, in the early 2000s, the agency, and particularly the Office of Research and Development, developed the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, and they survey 4 types of systems: rivers and streams, lakes, coastal condition, and wetland condition. And so these are every 5 years, these surveys are conducted. I'm going to talk a little bit about the National Rivers and Streams Assessment, mostly about the National Rivers and Streams Assessment, and a little bit about the National Lakes Assessment. These surveys are designed to sample all of the U.S. flowing waters. It's 2,000 samples about every 5 years, and so I'm going to present data from three surveys, and it's about 5,000 samples. It's basically sending a crew out to measure all kinds of stuff, and so they go out for one day, and they in the kind of the growing season, and they measure physical habitat, stream flow, insects, fish, algae, water chemistry, which is what I'll be speaking about. They use a probability-based design, so we can say something about ecoregional status and also national condition of the waters. This probability design from our main statistician allows weighted estimates of the entire coterminous U.S., which is about 1.4 million miles of streams. So we can take those numbers and we can translate them and extrapolate to that whole stream miles. And the recent report came out in 2018, from the 2018 to 2019 data came out last winter. So for each of the little dots on the map, that's a stream sample. So we have about 5,000 samples between 2000 and 2014. And each one of those dots, we can draw a watershed upstream, and we can say these are the largest sources. So we just take all the sources and we look at the largest ones. So we can kind of simplify things and look at what's important. And it looks kind of like those maps that I showed you earlier, but maybe a little bit different, a little more detailed. Obviously in the center, on the left is nitrogen and on the right is phosphorus. In the center of the US, in the Corn Belt, we see farm fertilizer as the largest source. Along the edges and in the southeast and many areas of the west, we have the brown, which is livestock waste, as the largest source. We can see areas in the west and in the east and the upper Midwest where we have deposition as the largest source. These are largely forested areas or natural areas, or areas where there's multiple sources kind of coming together, but deposition is the largest one. And then you can see in the both maps, there's kind of an orange color on the phosphorus map, which is human waste. There's a kind of pink color, which is the urban fertilizer, that's human waste. And we also can track urban fertilizer, which is non-farm fertilizer, things like golf courses and yards. And so I guess one important point is that there are some large sources, but there's also variation across space, and that's something that tells, we can tell something about what the management needs are across space. So the proportion of the US, this is taking that approach using the statistics to be able to say what the national pattern is. And so across the US, for the stream miles, across the flowing stream miles across the coterminous US, for nitrogen, about half of the streams, agricultural sources are the largest, and the deposition for the other half. It's very different for phosphorus. For phosphorus, about 60% is agricultural sources, closer to 70% is agricultural sources, with manure being the largest source. We can also zoom in and look at sites which have poor nutrient condition. So either poor for nitrogen on the left or phosphorus on the right. And you can see for nitrogen, we kind of increase the share of agricultural sources. So agricultural sources are much more important in areas where we have poor nutrient condition. For phosphorus, it doesn't really change that much. It shifts a little bit to increase, but we clearly have a lot of phosphorus sites, which are where ag source is very important, and other sites, where waste is important or deposition. And this is just the summary for each of the, for both of the surveys, for the 3 survey periods, most recent survey periods, 8-9, 13-14, and 18-19. Nitrogen on the left, 44% of streams across the U.S., stream miles across the U.S. are considered to be in poor condition for nitrogen. And then for phosphorus, it's gone from 51 to 59 to 42. It's varied over time. It looks like there might be an improvement in phosphorus, but it's not exactly clear what's driving that. But certainly we're seeing very high proportion of streams that are in poor condition with respect to phosphorus across the U.S. I'm also going to speak a little bit about using the data to look at some of the progress associated with the Clean Air Act. This really great movie shows you total sulfur deposition over time, and when it starts red, that's 2000, and then sulfur deposition has declined dramatically, about by 70% over the last 20 years or so because of the Clean Air Act amendment. So you see this improvement in air quality, especially in the East, where we had a lot of coal-fired plants. We look to see, is there a change in water quality associated with this Clean Air Act amendment? And so we do see nitrogen deposition has declined. That's kind of what the top graph shows you, with the red changing to pink or blue, especially in the East. Nitrogen deposition has declined. But what we do see is that stream organic nitrogen and stream organic carbon has increased over time. We're not seeing a difference in nitrate, and we're seeing an increase in total organic nitrogen and carbon. Not sure exactly what the drivers are, but it has implications for disinfection byproducts across the country. And it's an important but not very well studied aspect of what's going on. We don't really know what the mechanisms are. We have some hypotheses, but we need to better understand that. We've also been connecting the source information to cyanohabs, and so this is just the QR code for the Cyan Project, which Kate spoke about. This looks at the 2,200 largest lakes in the country. So cyanohabs can be a problem in small lakes, and there are better satellite data. Cyanohabs can also be a problem in benthic zones in streams and rivers, and that's something that we're just starting to learn about, just starting to study well, so that we can look at that. But we know that nutrients are a key driver of blooms. We're taking our inventory data and we're looking at the National Lakes Assessment information on, for example, the toxin microcystin, which is a widespread toxin associated with cyanohabs that's often monitored by drinking water utilities. And so this is one that we are trying to understand what are the drivers. And you can sort of see that there's some hot spots, but there's also places where you might have a clean lake right next to a lake that has high microcystin. And so there's just a lot of things that a lot of unknowns and uncertainties behind this risk. This is a probability of risk of microcystin. So on the last thing, I don't have a whole lot of time. I'm going to try to go through, is it working? And go quickly through that. And so we do a lot in terms of conservation practices. This is the USDA's Conservation Effectiveness Assessment Program, or CEAP, which is comparing 2010 to 2020. We see we've done a good job in reducing surface runoff over the last 10 or 15 years, but subsurface leaching continues to increase, and that's actually the largest, especially for nitrogen, that's the largest source of nitrogen that's moving into the landscape. And so maybe we need to do a better job. The implications would be we need to do a better job in reducing that subsurface leaching, especially when we're thinking about groundwater. So I'm just going to try to highlight some key research opportunities quickly here. Measuring nutrients related to the environment. We need maybe better information about how do we map and monitor fertilizers and manure. Phosphorus deposition, we're trying to get a better handle on it. It's not actually part of the NADP or the National Atmospheric Deposition Program, but they're trying to develop methods to improve those measurements because it does seem to be important in some places. Tracking crop harvest and surplus for management relevance, also soil testing, adding that. And there's a lot going on with animal systems and nutrient management associated with animal systems that we need to better understand. Water quality information, I think we need more machine learning approaches, which others have spoken about. And I really agree with the idea of all these young people coming in with strong R skills and coding skills and are able to make R shinies for the state. We've helped that at the state of Oregon that can create story maps that are used by the state or local entities. It really, there's a lot of folks with a lot of experience that are retiring, but there's a lot of young people with new, different skills that are coming into these jobs. Better access and analysis of existing water quality data. I would say the water quality portal, there's a lot of data there. There's also a lot of data collected by drinking water providers that I've rarely seen scientific studies that have looked at that data and presented it and tried to tie it to condition over time. It's some of the best data in the country that we have that the drinking water providers are collecting on the raw water or the source water. We need to look at that data and try to see what's going on and maybe put different systems together. Identifying gaps, there's a great Duke study that looks at this. If you just Google Duke and water quality portal, you'll find it. I have the link in the top. Cheaper, better sensors, use of satellite data. We've already heard all about that today. And then I think one of the things that I'm really on a bandwagon about, or whatever the word is, connecting conservation and management efforts to water quality, making those connections, doing a better job of making those connections. We have all this money, the infrastructure law, the BIL, all this information, these projects are going out. Are we seeing the changes in water quality that we're expecting? I think we're not closing the loop there, and I think that's one of our big challenges, and I'll stop there and be happy to, I guess at the end we'll have questions. So thank you very much for the invitation.